in this episode.
If it becomes easier and easier to use these types of technologies, then it also becomes easier and easier to kind of be influenced by these models that people use to kind of direct their desire. So desire is triangular. You want things because somebody else wants it as well. And these types of dynamics are now incredibly powerful in the role of machine learning. And I think it's kind of very interesting to kind of specifically think about this. First of all, you have all these powerful models. You have all these superstars of deep learning, of machine learning. You have these very large companies that are very good at capturing people's attention. And that then ties in with software that is increasingly easy to use. So that kind of creates kind of a feedback loop, like you have very powerful models that people imitate, but it also becomes easier and easier to do the imitation. And so that means that you kind of have the tendency for things to converge towards specific practices that then attract an enormous amount of people. And often these attractors, let's say the gravitas of these attractors might not be, their importance or their efficacy might not warrant that. So in other words, it might be some methods and some developments might be attractive because of these mimetic mechanism, not so much because the technologies themselves are so incredibly powerful. And I think that we see that now with large language models, right? So all this talk about artificial general intelligence, so we're almost there. We just need to make the models a bit bigger, and then maybe to fine tune them a bit more, and then they will suddenly be reliable and capable of reasoning. I find that quite mind-boggling. I think that will definitely not happen. And one of the predictions that I make, and I will do that now, I think that this year will be probably the big disappointment with what the large language models can.
Hey everyone, welcome to this far-ranging discussion on the evolution of deep learning and the philosophy of AI between Jon Eklöf, Thomas Hamelryck, and Karel Last. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Karel and the work he's doing at Philosophy Portal, which in fact recently I too became a student. And of course, Karel's been on the podcast before, and during our discussion he did mention that he worked on a paper with Thomas and Jon on this question of the evolution of deep learning and what they call the abstraction explosion. And the moment I read the paper, I immediately reached out to Karel saying that I'd love to host a paper discussion, because despite not being an academic, I really have been thinking about these themes that they've outlined in the paper just outside of academia as me, a software engineer, all the notions of abstraction and how literally the lines of code have reduced in projects because everything is now either a library, a framework, or some kind of remote API call. And so I really am thankful to Karel that he managed to get all of us together and have this discussion despite the time differences and all of our commitments and whatnot. I don't want to ramble on too much, as I tend to do in these introductions. However, sorry for the trite comment, but needless to state, AI, the so-called AI revolution, is having an unbelievable impact, of almost an event in our society right now. I mean, just recently, of course, there was the whole, let's call it the DeepSeek event, or the DeepSeek even spectacle, not sure what to call it, which tanked the stock markets of NVIDIA and some of the tech companies, the fun vicissitudes of capitalism. So the discussions pertaining to how this evolution of deep learning and AI is a part of what they call the technological meta transition in society is certainly an interesting one. And even for people who aren't anthropologists or sociologists or even philosophers, I think this discussion certainly matters, which is why there are a lot of dialogues around this topic at the moment. Be that as it may, as I said, I don't want to prolong this introduction, so before we get to it, a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times, I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said though, forgive me for the tautology. We, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some kind of financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider financially supporting this podcast through Patreon, Substack, or PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall perks. You're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's publicly available is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters on Patreon, Substack, and even PayPal. However, if you're considering supporting the project, please do so only if you have the means. Alright, back to the episode. Professor Thomas Hamelryck is a lecturer and researcher in machine learning and computational biology at the Bioinformatics Centre at the University of Copenhagen Biocenter. He specialises in Bayesian modeling and probabilistic machine learning, and his current research focuses on applying these methodologies to protein structure prediction and protein evolution. Professor Hamelryck is also a deep reader of Réne Girard and works closely with Philosophy Portal and other independent education institutions. Dr. Jon Eklöf is the Global Chief Data and Analytics Officer at GKN Aerospace. He has a background in law, professional negotiation, and computer science. He also did his PhD at the University of Copenhagen with a thesis titled AI Transformation in the Manufacturing Industry. The paper, Abstraction, Mimesis, and the Evolution of Deep Learning, was based on his PhD research. Dr. Karel Lars is an anthropologist and Hegelian philosopher who's interested in biocultural evolution, mind-matter relations, and speculative futures. His PhD thesis, Global Brain Singularity, focuses on all three of these topics. He is the author of Systems and Subjects, Enter the Alien, and many other interdisciplinary books. Dr. Lars has taught multiple courses on Hegel's Science of Logic, Sigmund Freud's Unconscious, Alan Zupanchik's What is Sex, and is also the founder of Philosophy Portal, an education platform focused on teaching the foundational philosophical discourses of the modern world. And now, without further ado, here's a discussion on the abstraction explosion and the evolution of deep learning. I don't know that what I refer to as like professor or doctor, but now that I know that professor means to be profane, I'm not sure if people knew that, if they'd appreciate me referring to them as that. Yeah, cool. So firstly, if it's okay, a bit of a biographical note. I mean, I know people don't really like talking about themselves. However, more for yourself, Thomas and Jon, as I did mention before we just started recording, yeah, people in tech, people in kind of CS world, they they kind of superficially engage with philosophy as like sort of airy-fairy self-help stoicism stuff. And I think now, because of mostly Peter Thiel, there's an interest even in Réne Girard amongst so-called tech bros. But I'm curious with you both. How did you get involved in working quite deeply with philosophy? I mean, the point where you're like working in philosophy portal and like writing papers with Cadell and just not just like you know yeah, superficial stuff, but actually trying to like deeply work through this work in almost a scholarly fashion. So maybe if you could just comment on that a bit, we'll go from there, please. Maybe start with you, Thomas.
I think I just met the wrong people. Yeah, well, I think that it's literally meeting some people who were doing philosophy in an original way. I think like the first person that I met that really was doing philosophy was Alexander Barth, Swedish philosopher, and started reading his books. Start with the Syntheism book, and I got really interested in one specific thinker. It was Alfred North Whitehead, process philosophy. And then I spent quite a bit of time reading up on that, and also, meeting more and more people who were doing philosophy outside of an academic context. And then I also got interested in various thinkers who were trying to make sense of human behavior, like Jacques Lacan and Jung, and finally then converging to Réne Girard and a lot of thinkers around Réne Girard. So I think that's kind of my journey in a nutshell. Of course, you can always kind of go deeper. What you have to start the causality somewhere, right? So I would say, it's mimetic desire. You pick up the things that other people also want to have, and I just started picking up the habit from philosophers. Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll be discussing a lot of that in this conversation. And yeah, yourself, Joe?
So I wonder if I can even say that I am into philosophy. So I started off as a musician and then transitioned into becoming a lawyer. And then from there, I went into becoming a professional negotiator. And then from there, I turned to computer science. And I got in touch with Thomas first time through Alexander Bard, the Swedish philosopher. And I've read a couple of his books. I'm more into the biological aspects of human behavior, so human behavioral biology, so Sapolsky, Jack Panksepp, and those types of uh, thinkers more. I've studied some Jungian philosophy, but I meeting these guys, so meeting the wrong people, you realize that if you think you're in deep water, well, you're actually just in a very sort of shallow, calm lake compared to the guys swimming in the deep.
Yes, yes. In fact, what are your views on the work that, Philosophy Portal does with like Lacan, Hegel, that kind of philosophy?
Yeah, so I'm not into that type of philosophy,
Okay, okay. I mean, as in,
honestly.
even if you're not into it, now that you've seen, you collaborated with Cadell and Thomas and all of that, just
But I have to kind of interrupt you, but actually I kind of agree with John. I don't consider myself a philosopher. I mean, I read some philosophy like Alfred North Whitehead, but I wouldn't call myself a philosopher at all. It's just like there are a lot of useful ideas there that can pick up and use them. I don't know if there's a distinction there, but I never call myself a philosopher.
I try to make sense of the world.
mm,
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, Simon Critchley, when I spoke to him, he said that in many ways, a philosopher shouldn't really even call themselves a philosopher in like the academic sense because they kind of always kind of sit outside the almost symbolic order. I mean, I wouldn't say outside the symbolic order, but they're always going to be somewhat of an outsider within kind of the established order of things in some sense.
So
So
maybe we are philosophers after all
I was
because
just going
we're
to
not
say,
philosophers.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, it's already getting complicated. Yeah, I
Yeah.
see that. Yeah, yeah. I hardly ever talk to philosophers from academia, actually.
I mean, I do because of my master's, and I love it. It's very interesting. However, yeah, man,
Yeah,
like
you have a master's in philosophy?
no, yeah,
What's your?
I'm doing a master's by research in philosophy. But it's more like phenomenology and cog sci and phenomenology. Although. I mean, I'm sure we can have this conversation offline, Cadell. Like my next step, I'm thinking is to do the philosophy with Philosophy Portal, and then do in kind of establish academia, go down the AICS route because, to be honest, like the philosophy I'm interested in is the speculative kind, which you just can't find. At least in Australia, it's virtually impossible to find people working in. The let's call it the speculative philosophy kind of like Hegel, Zizek, Lacan. That's cool. Anyways, be that as it may. All right, to the paper. Uh, the evolution of deep learning. I'm sorry, abstraction, mimesis, and the evolution of deep learning. So maybe to get started, if you could just tell us again, starting with you, Thomas. How did this come together? This project of writing this together. Like, what was the impetus behind you three collaborating along with the other collaborators to write this paper? And then we'll go from there.
So Cadell doesn't need any introduction because everybody knows him, or how
I'm
does that work?
I'll
You're
just say,
famous, Cadell.
no, I'll just say very quickly that I mean I have a unity with what you guys are talking about in the sense that in terms of my academic background, I've never actually taken an academic philosophy course. I started in anthropology. I was like a bit between anthropology, history, and a bit of biology. And then I went into my doctorate in technically an interdisciplinary department, which was very wide-ranging, inter-transdisciplinary in a sense, but certainly not explicitly or conventionally philosophical. But it was kind of through the exploration of inter and transdisciplinarity in an open way that I kind of stumbled into the necessity of philosophy. And I would sort of relate to what Rahul was citing with Simon Critchley in regards to, philosophy proper kind of operating on the periphery, oftentimes, of, say, quote unquote, the symbolic order. And that oftentimes the people who become philosophers, and I think this is perhaps even especially true after Hegel, that people operating outside of philosophy in their time retroactively become within philosophy, like perhaps Nietzsche as an example, perhaps Freud as an example of people who maybe wouldn't have self-identified or even seen themselves as anti-philosophical, retroactively being taken up by philosophy within the philosophical narrative proper. So I think that's an interesting tension to play with and think with. Even I would say that figures like Newton and Descartes would label their work, say, natural philosophy. Newton explicitly labeled his text natural philosophy. And so now he's seen as a physicist. So there's also a weird oscillation where people doing weird speculative work on the edges of things, almost establishing paradigms for new fields, are philosophical in their time and then get taken up, say, by a science. So there's all sorts of weird topsy-turvy. Philosophy is a weird field in the sense that it's, I think, seen as the queen of the sciences or things like that, or underlying the sciences. So, from outside in view, and here I don't want to project on you, Thomas, but from my perspective, exploring, say, anthropology and then coming to the necessity of philosophy is almost like exploring a field and then trying to come to the first principles of a field, or realizing you need to go back to the first principles of a field and sort of start from a speculative ground zero. And it sounds kind of, I don't want to project, but you're sort of in a certain scientific field, and then coming to figures like Girard and Whitehead is almost like coming to, all right, let's go back to first principles. What am I actually trying to think here? How am I trying to think, make sense about the world? So yeah, I just want to emphasize this weird topsy-turvy nature of philosophy, how hard it is to categorize, who is a philosopher, who isn't a philosopher. Oftentimes people who are just within academic philosophy proper are simply just teaching a discourse. Like, even I just had a recent conversation with a philosopher named Dylan Shaw about Plato, and he says, even though I've studied philosophy, I don't consider myself a philosopher in the sense that I'm just at the moment reproducing the discourses of Plato or Derrida, and I haven't actually produced, a philosophy, or I don't consider myself a philosopher. I consider myself more a historian of philosophy at this point. So just to preface with some of these weird inversions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in fact, let me start with the provocation here. I completely concur with your latter point, Cadell. I think most people who in academia call themselves philosophers are actually historians of philosophy. They aren't philosophers proper, the way I'd consider someone like Zizek would be, or the Slovenian school, where there's really they're introducing new concepts or re-theorizing or reformulating what we thought we already knew. So, I mean, Graham Harman said this he said that philosophy is it doesn't even really make progress in that sense. Like you can't even call it progress in the way you'd call the other epistemological disciplines. It's just maybe once every 100 years you get some breakthrough, but it moves very slowly. But yeah. Sorry, I wasn't being rude with Cadell. It's just it's Cadell's. I feel like everyone who follows work on my podcast already know of Cadell, so it's just I just thought we'll get going. But also I'll be doing introductions separately. But thanks for pointing that out, Thomas. But yeah, back to the paper. Just on that. So yeah, how did this come together? What was the impetus behind writing this? If you could probably again start with you, Thomas, and then Jon, and please Cadell too.
Maybe Jon can can give that story, because he probably
so this paper was part of my PhD thesis on AI transformation in the manufacturing industry. And so it was an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary PhD thesis trying to bridge management research, CS research, with like trying to understand how the hell do you get AI into a manufacturing company, and me working in the aerospace industry, and why is it so difficult, and what are the implications of working with it from different angles. And one of the things that we struggle with is that, so you think you've achieved something, and then a new technology arrives that completely overthrows everything that you thought was relevant. So, and then Thomas said, so shouldn't we try somehow to quantify the technological development that we see? Has anyone ever done it? So because people say, yeah, technology moves at a faster pace, and what's state of the art today might be obsolete tomorrow, and so on. But then we know that the technological development is fast, but how fast? How much more efficient do we become? So then Thomas said, shouldn't we try to count the number of lines of code of deep learning projects? Because at this time, this was 2019, 2020, deep learning with that word rather than LLMs or those type of words were the thing. So we looked at deep learning repositories in GitHub, and then Alex, who is one of the co-authors, built a script that downloaded, searched GitHub, and then took ages to download all these repositories and scanned through the number of lines of code. And we destroyed the computer a couple of times because we downloaded malware from China and so on. But then finally, we ended up with this sample. So, and then we realized, okay, so what the hell are we going to do with this sort of material? And then Thomas again said, we should work with a philosopher. And I happen to know the guy. And along came Cadell and taught us the word ephemeralization, for example.
Okay, so what does that mean, ephemeralization?
The ability to do more with less until eventually you can do everything with nothing.
Oh yes, there's a quote on the paper. It's mentioned. Yes, everything with nothing. Yeah.
So that was the background to the paper.
Okay. So I didn't know it was a part of your PhD thesis. Very interesting. Right, but where does Girard come in here? I mean, I get the notion of abstraction. I have a few questions pertaining to abstraction, apropos like the philosophy of science and kind of how knowledge works. I've been thinking about that too, as like a social practice. But yeah, where did Réne Girard come into this?
Well, I think I can give a bit more background about why we did this. So if you look at, so there was this breakthrough in deep learning, right, which is 2012, the ImageNet competition, which was won by AlexNet. And I think that had like 34,000 lines of code or something like that. But by the time that I was working with probabilistic models and deep learning, we could actually make pretty cutting-edge models with like 100 lines of code. And so in a couple of years, it was like the progress and the ease of use increased tremendously. And so there was this idea that, I of course teach this stuff. So I teach probabilistic machine learning, I teach data science and so on. So I try to give the students an idea of how fast this field was moving and how important it was to kind of keep up with current technology. So I often see companies working with technologies that are complicated and not very effective. And it's because they don't keep track with the ongoing progress. And so I came up with this idea of an abstraction explosion. So you can do more and more with less and less. So you have all of these software frameworks, these software libraries. As you say, everything is an import now, right? So it started with Tiano, which was an academic project, and you had PyTorch and TensorFlow and so on. Now you have JAX. So it becomes easier and easier to do very complicated things. So, and we called that abstraction explosion. And one of the ways, one of the things that we wanted to do, we wanted to put some numbers on it, not just talk about it, but actually kind of say like, well, here's a graph, and this illustrates a bit some aspects of what's going on. So, and that's when we came up with this idea of looking at the number of lines in the repositories. And you could see that in the beginning, you had like most of the deep learning projects, they were very large, thousands and thousands of lines. And in the end, you can find the graph in the article, right? In the end, you can see that it really diminishes quite spectacularly. So it just illustrates something that's sort of a deeper phenomenon that's going on, and it puts some hard numbers on it.
Yeah. I mean, along this, you could even kind of probably outline that, like, okay, a large language model itself, in some sense, is an abstraction over an abstraction, right? Like, as in, well, if it's just a prompt chatbot, and if
Right.
the purpose of a programming language is to instruct a machine to do something, in some sense, if you tell an LLM, like, I don't know, ChatGPT or Claude or something, hey, give me this TypeScript React code to create, like, I don't know, a web page, it'll quickly prompt something and it'll give you like a simple code to make some kind of web page, but that itself is an abstraction over the code that we already use. I mean, we in the same way how, as you pointed out, Thomas, where there are like the myriad libraries and frameworks both in programming and in the world of deep learning. So I guess this is itself a part of this abstraction explosion that you write off in the paper, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. But so then, I mean, the notion of mimesis, perhaps, I mean, you're probably the in-house Girardian here, Thomas. So please, if you could,
Yeah, certainly am.
enlighten us on, why bring Réne Girard's ideas into this at all? Like, I get I think the notion of abstraction, most people who work in programming kind of get it almost intuitively. I mean, in OOP, we even have abstraction as a principle, right? In object-oriented programming.
Yeah.
But when we speak of someone like, why even bring the work of Réne Girard into this conversation?
Well, because you can kind of see that abstraction ties in with mimesis. If it becomes easier and easier to use these types of technologies, then it also becomes easier and easier to kind of be influenced by these models that people use to kind of direct their desire. So desire is triangular. You want things because somebody else wants it as well. And these types of dynamics are now incredibly powerful in the world of machine learning. And they are I think it's kind of very interesting to kind of specifically think about this. First of all, you have all these powerful models. You have all these superstars of deep learning, of machine learning. You have these very large companies that are very good at capturing people's attention. And that then ties in with software that is increasingly easy to use. So that kind of creates kind of a feedback loop, like you have very powerful models that people imitate, but it also becomes easier and easier to do the imitation. And so that means that you kind of have the tendency for things to converge towards specific practices that then attract an enormous amount of people. And often these attractors, let's say the gravitas of these attractors might not be, their importance or their efficacy might not warrant that. So in other words, it might be some methods and some developments might be attractive because of these mimetic mechanism, not so much because the technologies themselves are so incredibly powerful. And I think that we see that now with large language models, right? So all this talk about artificial general intelligence, so we're almost there. We just need to make the models a bit bigger, and then maybe fine tune them a bit more, and then they will suddenly be reliable and capable of reasoning. I find that quite mind-boggling. I think that will definitely not happen. And one of the predictions that I make, and I will do that now, I think that this year will be probably the big disappointment with what the large language models can do. They're a fantastic technology, deeply impressive. I use it a lot, and especially in bioinformatics, they've made an enormous impact. But I think that they have very important limitations, and the reason that people don't really want to see that, or that they have such an attraction, is, I think, mimetic.
Yeah, I concur. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this notion of, again, pertaining to abstraction. In some sense, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, especially as in Hegelians, isn't all thinking in some sense like a social abstraction? As in, like if we take how knowledge works, let me see if I could articulate myself here. So, obviously, none of us can ever be an expert at every single discipline in the modern world, right? Not everyone can be an expert in physics and anthropology and biology. Maybe the last like great mind, like the kind of polymath type, was probably Leibniz, who had like just worked across multiple fields. So in some sense, the way anyone working in like be it academia or any kind of like knowledge work, to use that term, is that we use an input of the work that someone has already done, and we take like an abstract concept, and then we import that into the work we're doing. So an example here would be let's say something like evolutionary psychology. A psychologist might not have studied evolution the way a biologist has in like a deep sense, like studying the animals and like doing all the research in a very systematic, meticulous manner, but rather would just read a paper written by some biologist, let's say, or an evolutionary biologist, and just take like the gist or an abstract concept of it, and then apply that to kind of the work they're doing. And this is where like I'm interested to see how, like in your view, is the abstraction you speak of here pertaining to, let's say, computer science and AI? Is it qualitatively different to the kind of the what I see as the abstraction that exists in our, let's call it, social epistemology, or how knowledge works in some sense in human society as like a collective enterprise? Or is it still a part of the same MO, same framework, let's say, or the same, I'm trying to think of the word here. Kind of the same spirit, let's say, if that makes sense. So, did my question make sense there, Karel?
Yeah, totally. So I think that in a roundabout way, I'm going to try and respond to you here by suggesting that what's going on here, at least from my perspective, is that an entire paradigm change in terms of technology is forcing us to reconsider our underlying social in regards to what you were saying about Leibniz as sort of the last polymath and sort of entering in this world of the necessity of specialization. For a long time now, our institutions have struggled to accommodate more general thinkers, like a Leibniz, right? And even this might be related to what I was mentioning previously about philosophy and philosophers often falling out on the periphery of institutions, because those philosophers or that philosophical thinking needs to happen, but it's so general in a certain way and so hard to categorize and contain in a certain way that it can only be recouped by the institutions retroactively. So the way in which institutions currently function is through this specialization mechanism where people are doing very specialized work in technology, for example, and then that change, but then that has a huge social effect. And we're seeing this increasing transformation of our societies driven by technological transformations, which are coming from specialization. And I mean, I think, the example that you're describing in your situation is a really good one in a sense, because, you're in the institutions, you're saying, I'm going to keep studying cog sci or artificial intelligence in the institutions, but I need to get the more philosophical speculative work. I can't find it in the institutions. So I have to go to an entity that's operating in some sense outside on the periphery of the institutions, right? So there's this weird relationship that's at work between, let's say, the technological paradigms and the underlying social epistemology that's going on. And I think that this is kind of like what my understanding of the abstraction explosion is. It's kind of like a very radical application of thinking about punctuated equilibrium or even Kuhnian paradigm shifts, that it's not just a paradigm shift just purely on a theory level, but it's on the level where theory is changing the actuality of technology, which is then changing the basic life world in which we inhabit. And so there's all this at play, and it's just a matter of how do we now think about the form of cognition we need to cultivate in order to handle this surprise, this discontinuity, this disruption, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, another thing I was thinking of while kind of reading this paper for the second time is I don't know if you're familiar with Borges's very, very popular short story. This really influenced even Baudrillard. Is like the map and the territory distinction. So just to put it simply, Borges writes of this in some ancient town, some village or city or something. This group of cartographers, they start mapping out that city, and they start building a map of the city, and eventually they try to make this map exactly align with what the city is, and they keep growing this map to a point where hundreds of years later, people stopped relying on the city as the real thing and they think the map is the city. So the territory people consider to be the real thing. So my reading of that is people think the abstraction becomes like the thing in itself. And then I don't know. I wonder if, for example, okay, another example here from physics, right? Sabine Hossenfelder has been very critical of how in physics they aren't making any progress because people have fallen in love with the beauty of mathematics, and like physics has become a purely kind of mathematical discipline where you aren't even talking about the physical world but rather kind of playing this abstract mathematical game. So I don't know, I'm just trying to understand, we speak of the abstraction explosion. We spoke of mimesis, how that works in terms of like our desires, let's say. But then another thing you all bring up is this notion of the black box problem in this paper. So there are a few things we're putting into this, putting out here, a few concepts. And along with this, I guess my question would be, yeah, to probably take a bit of a critical lens. What are the drawbacks of in this paradigm shift, in this abstraction explosion? Like, are we missing out something when it seems like knowledge is, it's becoming this very, well, I guess knowledge was always an abstract discipline, but at a certain point, by purely living in abstractions, let's say, are we missing out on something, or are we like, is it hindering progress in us understanding reality?
I would want to add something because I think the whole society is built upon layers of abstractions, and we just don't see how many levels down we've lost because we're so busy living in our current level of abstraction. So even though it's not an abstraction, but I typically make this analogy that if you find a person in the Stone Age and their cell phone breaks down, it isn't much of an issue because they don't even know how to use a cell phone. Or if that you say to them, well, your bank just went bankrupt, so all your money are gone. Well, they didn't have money. But if that happens to us, our whole world breaks down. Or as we lost our internet the other week, and my daughter was panicking because she didn't know how to relate to this physical world. Because she's so used to living in an abstract world that is provided to her at all times. And it isn't really an issue until the abstractions break down. And then, and the same happens, like if we talk about this specific paper, we don't really know what's happening within the algorithms, within the deep learning algorithms. Or when they break down, it's not really that many people left who know how to fix it or even know what broke.
And is this what you all mentioned, refer to as the black box problem? Because of course,
so the black box problem is more that you don't really know. So if you think so, LLMs is a very good example, I think, because just because LLMs behave or the output of LLMs are such that it reassembles human language, for example. It doesn't mean that the underlying logic is human language. It doesn't necessarily reach to the conclusions it does in the same way that a human would reach the conclusions. We've seen that now. So I've been working with this within my company, trying to do different sorts of things with LLM. So for example, we built a classification tool for incidents. It's very like someone vomited in the men's restroom. No one cleaned it up for a week. So we know as humans, wow, that's like infectious, contagious somehow. But then the algorithm says, oh, someone vomited in the men's restroom. And we said, don't focus on the primary stuff, focus on the secondary. Oh, okay, sorry. And as we know, having interacted with LLMs, it says, oh, I'm very sorry. Yeah, but someone vomited in the men's restroom. So there is something happening underneath the hood of the abstractions that no one really knows. And that is the black box problem. So you don't know what's going on. Then at the same time, I think it's reasonable to point out, we don't really know what's going on under our own hoods either, how we reach to our conclusions.
That's what I was going to, yeah.
So we're asking more of computers than maybe of humans, I'd say.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jon, because yeah, I mean, don't humans have a black box problem too? I mean,
yeah, and this is also fascinating talking about AI, because all of a sudden people are so interested about truth. But we've been lying about, or talking at least about, there being some kind of God, and people have just brought that concept uncritically over thousands of years. But now, when you got an AI algorithm, they go like, oh, well, how can I trust this? Well, how the hell can you even trust your own judgment? Can you even?
Yeah. Oh man, I have a lot to say because, like, first of all, yes, completely. The whole notion that, yeah, I mean, like I can't say it's a truth is, it's like fiction. It's structured like fiction, right? So in some sense, even for us, the way we get at truth is through like kind of like a notion of symbolic fiction. And then one thing I really like, this I spoke to the psychoanalyst, and he speaks about how the way the unconscious functions for humans is it's like a split in the symbolic order, in the sense that it's when something goes wrong that's when you see the unconscious. It's not like there's something deep behind the scenes, behind the veil, some substantial truth. So in some sense, we all a black box. And the other thing I want to discuss here is, yeah, as you mentioned, Jon, I very much defend abstractions. It's quite common, I think, now because of, again, this abstraction explosion for people to be rather critical of this, overly abstracting everything in like our knowledge disciplines. However, in some sense, all of human society is built on a layer of abstractions, and here's where I really like the kind of the GKN philosophy, where when you try to pull apart all these abstractions, what do you find? You find nothing. You find just the abyss, the void. And so maybe we need these abstractions even for our subjectivity. But no, there was a lot there. So, okay, just to hone in a bit more on the topic at hand, which is deep learning, I'd like if for people, more like neophytes like myself who are kind of like outside academia and all this, kind of interested in these topics, what's like the current research paradigm? Is there still, okay, so let me see if I could articulate this question. So obviously, in the general public, especially in like the business world, there's a lot of interest in LLMs, and there's a lot of interest in what they call AI agents now. Microsoft, they're trying to like build these AI agents for companies and all that. However, there are people like Jan LeCun, for instance. There are people, even Francois Chalet, who have mentioned if you're going into AI research, like let's say if you are a PhD student, there's don't research LLMs, but rather focus on yes, still neural networks and deep learning, but focus on other areas other than large language models. So just if you could just like kind of tell us about currently, is most of the interest still in LLMs, large language models, or is now the zeitgeist shifting where yes, there's still going to be interest in neural networks, but not particularly in the application of neural networks in large language models. I guess what I'm trying to say here is in terms of in the lines of like mimesis, where is research shifting towards in the world of AI? Maybe you could comment on that, Thomas.
Yeah, let's maybe just maybe I'll just add a couple of things about this black box thing and abstraction, right? This article this is more like trying to understand what's going on. It doesn't really complain about things. It's not like, oh, we should get rid of abstraction, or this is good, or this is bad. It's more like examining, like, this is the situation. This is where we are now. This is the situation. And now let's start to think about what's going on. What are the good things? What are the bad things? So it's not so much about complaining about abstraction. We could completely agree with you. This is mostly a really great thing, right? You can develop very complicated things very quickly. But what we also see is that, for example, all of these software frameworks that people are using, so they also have bugs. And often now people are very confident with using these, with working at a certain level of abstraction, but even just recognizing or finding out that there is a bug is not easy for them anymore. So so it's kind of like a double-edged sword, right? It's really great, you can get things done very quickly, but when things are not going, when there are problems, sometimes it's even difficult to figure out that something is wrong. Like you can have, for example, a PhD student who keeps on looking for a bug in his or her code. It turns out that there's a bug in the software that's being used to make the programs, and then the error messages that you get are often incredibly difficult to understand. Yeah. And then when something goes wrong, well, because people are trained at a very high level of abstraction, everybody knows Python, everybody knows how to do matrix multiplication if it's just calling a function in NumPy or in PyTorch. But often, like, there's very little knowledge about these algorithms left. So that's potentially a big problem. And then also just the fact that, so you're talking about large language models. Well, who says that neural networks are a good idea? Who even knows that neural networks are the final answer? Everybody seems to kind of think that they will be around forever. There was an article on something called a Kolmogorov-Arnold network, which had similar properties to neural networks, like universal approximations and stuff like that, but they were based on different principles. So this is kind of like the power of mimetics, right? Because everybody's working on these neural networks, so everybody stays within this paradigm. A couple of years ago, it was all support vector machines. That was all the rage. Enormous amounts of academics were working on that, and now that has all but disappeared. So a lot of this stuff is bubbles, mimetic hypes, thought collectives, herd behavior, and it's good to be aware of that and think about that a bit, so that maybe you can think out of the box, because that's why universities are still here, right? I hope. Yeah.
Actually, I think we didn't really elucidate this point. I think it's important for people that have no idea what we're talking about as it pertains to Réne Girard. Yeah, could you just on the notion of this mimetic bubbles and all this, you'll even write on like mimetic deadlocks. So yeah, maybe outline a bit more if you could please, Thomas, then how, yes, you did speak of like desire and mimesis, but also, yeah, what do you mean by mimetic bubbles? But also, what are these mimetic deadlocks that take place in society? And then maybe you could connect that to the current conversation, which is where like research and let's say AI is going.
Yeah, right. So Girard famously said, so the human is the animal that doesn't know what it wants. So in order to know what we want, we look at other people. And that means like the car that you want, the career, the wife, and so on and so on. So this goes very, very deep, right? So it's not just a tendency. That's how we determine what we want. We look at others. And then for example, in the case of machine learning, so it attracts an enormous amount of funding and enormous amount of attention. So in order to determine what you will research on and what you will use and where your attention will be, you will look at other people. And you will be attracted by these shiny models that are doing something that everybody else also finds interesting. And that means that everybody will start working on the same thing. So now it's large language models. That's why, for example, LeCun says, don't work on large language models, which are purely inductive, which are incredibly limited. So they don't do deduction. I don't think that they will ever do that in a reliable way. They don't do abduction. That means hypothesis formulation. So because of this, you have these mimetic bubbles. So these very attractive ways of doing things because everybody's working on them, and that can create mimetic deadlock. So an enormous amount of resources that go into the same, basically thinking about the same things in almost the same way.
Yeah. Okay. Now maybe you can get a bit provocative here, Thomas. Just on what you mentioned about deduction and induction. So Geoffrey Hinton, who obviously recently won a Nobel Prize for his work on
in physics.
In physics, interestingly enough,
Yeah.
and he look, I'm sure brilliant guy, but in one of his recent interviews, he mentioned that he mentioned that LLMs essentially reason the way we do, and this was his reasoning, so to speak. He said that, yeah, that was my reaction too, Jon. What he said was, well, in like there's the AI winter after like Minsky wrote that famous paper. The famous book called Perceptron or something about like critiquing how AI systems aren't good or at like formal logic or what they try to put in. And then there was the AI winter, and then what Hinton says is afterwards with the huge amounts of compute we had with GUIs that can do really fast matrix multiplications and whatnot. So his whole thinking is we humans also reason using intuition. So it's like intuition as logic in the sense that we how we learn about the world is like if you take a mathematician, the way initially the way a mathematician would reason about a certain mathematical problem is they'll have like an intuition or a hunch, and they'll based on that they'll kind of work out some theorem and do their mathematics. And he says that's kind of how even large language models reason, because really with like with tokens, what it does is it kind of predicts the next best token in like a probabilistic sense, right? And so I mean, so his whole thinking is, yeah, because LLMs use this like this token system and probability that's similar to how we humans reason inductively using our intuitions. So when, you know, a pretty big shot in kind of the AI world makes a claim like that, how would you all respond? And I'd like to hear all three of yours response to that. So maybe we'll go with, in fact, Thomas and then Jon and Karel, please.
Now, this is very, very language based. So did you basically so first of all, I mean, nobody says, I mean, of course, humans are very messy with respect to their reasoning. So the question is then also, what does that actually mean, artificial general intelligence? Does that mean you want to recreate humans exactly how humans reason? So first of all, that's already not really what we want. We want to have something that's super reliable. And in order to do that, we need machines that can think in terms of causality, that can do perfect deduction, where it can do things that are provably correct. I mean, there's a whole branch. I'm in a section at the university that's very interested in the theory of computation. I mean, they make programs that are provably correct and stuff like that. These LLMs are like, it's the exact opposite, right? So causality, induction, deduction, abduction. Abduction means that you can make hypotheses about the world. That means humans have an internal world representation. We don't just generate language. We have a body which is embedded in the world. We have a model of the world. All of these things are completely absent from LLMs. And then believing that this can just be solved as the play of signifier. That's like even worse than Lacan, who also kind of sees the human mind as a kind of a play of the signifiers, right? So if we make a caricature of Lacan. So I often actually think that Lacan's model of the human mind kind of reminds me a bit of an LLM. So maybe all of these people are Lacanians in some in some sense. So I think that I agree with Lukun that a lot of things are missing, like causal reasoning, deduction, the development of an internal worldview, persistence of memory, and all of that stuff. So if you want something that is maybe not an artificial general intelligence, but something that is reliable and very useful for complicated tasks, I think that's not really. If we just stay within LLMs, I don't think that's quite on the horizon. Even very simple tasks are impossible to implement reliably with these models. I think that would be my take on it.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak here as a code monkey, aka a software engineer. I predict what's going to happen is all of these tech companies are going to try and use LLMs to write their code. And then 6 months down the line, they're going to have to hire double the amount of engineers to fix all the code that that the LLMs up, you know. So that's my prediction for this year. But anyway, on the note, Jon, what are your thoughts on the whole notion of like, do LLMs intuition the same way? Do they use intuition the same way human beings do, as you know, Hinton claims?
One of the things that I often reflect on is, how do people even know? So how can they be so sure? Like, how can Hinton say it's like this when we don't know how the human intuition works? Like, what is intuition? It's some kind of subconscious decision making that's being affected by what? Like hormonal levels, glucose levels, the amount of sleep, your genetical profile, your social experience. So if you look at, I forgot his name. He wrote The Weird People, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Jon Eklöf is his name. So there are a number of, and also assuming that there is just one human way of functioning. For example, he concludes that face recognition in non-literate groups of people resides in the whole brain, while we, at the expense of being able to read, have moved it to the right side of the brain. That means that our intuition and ability to recognize faces works in a completely different way. So I don't know how he can be so sure about anything, because I know so little. And that's sort of why I like philosophy, because it's not so damn sure about everything. But it's very easy to make a good point that, okay, so this is going to happen with large language models. Well, maybe we'll see, because we've all been wrong before. And if you really knew, you would invest in stocks in what would happen next, and you would live happily ever after.
Yeah, yeah. Karel?
So that's my view.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, but like I'll just say that in regards to the nature of philosophy, how it interfaces, I think, with what Thomas is pointing towards with mimetic desire is I would see philosophy at its best as a kind of critique of pure desire, in the sense of when everyone falls into a kind of mimetic bubble, say everyone working on LLMs, everyone thinking that everything could be solved with LLMs. You were giving the example of the mistakes that some companies are going to make by thinking in this way, needing to retroactively hire a bunch of engineers because they're not really thinking about the results of a faulty intuition that they have about LLMs. That the next big thing, will probably come from someone working outside of that field, someone focused on what no one right now is focused on. While everyone's caught up in working on LLMs, the person who's, again, on the periphery working on something completely unrelated to LLM, something that's only he or she can see as shiny, while everyone else is transfixed by sort of the collective mimetic desire, that there'll be a breakthrough, on that periphery. So, in regards to AGI specifically, what I'm sort of thinking about this week is inspired partly by an event in the portal with Layman Pascal. He suggested the idea of HGI, which is just human general intelligence. And the idea that actually, under these layers of abstraction that what we've lost is perhaps human general intelligence, specifically through this hyper specialization. That, I just sort of make a meta point here that perhaps, this is just a hypothesis, I'd be interested to know what everyone here thinks, is that what we have in the history of computer science are specialized AI researchers thinking that we're missing AGI, when really what we're missing is HGI. We're missing, a human general intelligence. And what we've lost there is because everyone within sort of, again, an institutional educated framework is just hyper specialized, right? So and they think we need to create a general intelligence, but what we've lost is perhaps this more general intelligence that's already here in a certain way. Just we don't know how to bring it to the surface and work with it, to be more human. I'm kind of here thinking about what you posted on a note on Substack today, Rahul. Does the human exist?
Yeah.
Will it ever exist? These types of questions, bringing that to the surface. But, for me, researching technological singularity, the reason why I ended up needing philosophy was because to me it was kind of obvious that people working in AGI were taking their intuitions to ridiculous conclusions that obviously didn't make sense, and they were too certain of their own future prediction models, and actually needed to question their own presuppositions a little more. So, I'm not sure how that interfaces with the larger comments on LLMs and intuition, but that's kind of where I'm coming at with this.
Yeah, Karel, there's also something that we talked about, right? It's that questions that have been philosophical questions for hundreds of years. What is consciousness? What is sentience? And so on. They become engineering questions. Like a couple of years ago, there was this Google engineer who said, like, oh, this LLM talks to me like a human being. It is conscious. So now the question is it conscious or not? And then suddenly you are back to one of the most elementary philosophical questions: what is consciousness? There's a lot of people seem to think that you can download your consciousness into a machine. I think that Alfred North Whitehead would disagree with that. he would basically say like, well, you know, this sentient experience is highly tied to the exact molecular makeup, the process of the body, and that this consciousness is a process of that, and not just that you can kind of take some symbolic a mechanism that creates symbolic streams that in any way recreates your consciousness. So these are all philosophical questions, and it seems to me that in the world of computer science philosophers, so to say, that there's a great naivete. So I don't think that they've engaged with any thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead, for example, and I think that person for me is absolutely key. You really need to read Alfred North Whitehead if you really want to think about questions like sentience. And so there's also a lot of interesting philosophers thinking about that, like Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, who is he's in academia in the UK, and he does really great contemporary work around process philosophy and around Alfred North Whitehead. And I think that the interface between what people are doing in machine learning and what philosophers are doing, I think that more interfaces there and more co-thinking would enrich the space tremendously, I think.
I would like to add also that I think it's been, so if we look at Alan Turing's paper from 1950, he said that, can we create machines who think? And then he said, but we don't even know what it means to think. So therefore I have to construct the imitation game, because then we don't have to bother about defining it. So if we interact with a machine and we think we're interacting with a human, sort of, it lives, we've successfully executed the imitation game. But that's not so sexy to sell to investors, because if we think that the investments that went into the field of AI were made on the promises that now we're going to build a human-like intelligence, an artificial general intelligence, by John McCarthy et al. After 1956. And it's been on that assumption also that, and people want to, so the brain is so self-obsessed, like, can we create something that is equal to the human brain? Like, we don't talk so much, can we create a human level liver or human level gut, for example, which also holds some, according to some, cat level intelligence and can work without the brain. But there is something where throughout the years we've been so excited by what is human intelligence, and can we build automatas or things to imitate human intelligence, because that's more sexy.
Yeah. I mean,
and thus attracts more capital, and thus they need to pump this message through that we're going to come closer to AGI, because then they know that the money will flow. If they say we're going to make some automated statistical models that will improve certain things, probably like protein folding things and things that no one knows about, then it's hard to get the same type of funding based on that. But if you say the word AI, people go, wow.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, look, I mean, I have a whole section. I want to discuss this 5.4 democratization of deep learning, and I have a lot of questions on this specific topic. You'll see my inner Marxist come out here, but we'll leave the best for last, so to speak. Just on this note, though, yeah, Carl, I'm thank you for bringing that up, because the reason I've been thinking about it is this, right? So, okay, I'm going to put a lot of ideas here, so please bear with me for a moment. The question of like the human, it's as if the reason I always wonder, have we ever truly been human in this sense? Like, so okay,
this is what Carl Hayden Smith is thinking about, yeah, as well, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm thinking like we all speak of like this, humanism and all these like notions, right? But then the problem is, I personally believe that in some sense we have to be forced to be human. Like we aren't born human in a sense. Like we're born almost like we're I mean, like conscious, we're pre-born, right? We're born into a world of signifiers language. That's true. But I think even when we are born, and I think this is what culture and the arts and perhaps even philosophy does to us, that it tries to make us something like a human being. But when I say human, I don't mean this
The
human.
humanities.
Yeah, I mean as
The
like the
humanities is,
yeah,
yeah.
the humanities, yeah, better put. But also, in some sense, if you think of like the human existence, we always have this access to our existence, right? So I'll give us, I'm talking a bit like speculatively here, but let me give like a solid example. In AI, everyone talks about like reasoning and all of this. But what I really like, some theorists from like Isabel Miller and even Catherine Everett, she wrote this short blog post called "Does ChatGPT Enjoy?" So the idea is by bringing in these psychoanalytic concepts that they introduce this notion of, well, intelligence, everyone speaks about like reasoning and whatnot, but perhaps in my view, intelligence has something deeply it has like an affect to it. It has like desire, as in the what drives. I think I hate this notion where in the internet some people compare LLMs and ChatGPT to like junior software engineers. It's so insulting to junior software engineers. Junior software engineers are lovely people. Like they're motivated. They have desires. They want to build something. They aren't like these psychopaths who are like prompt engines who just like puts out code. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is when we speak of intelligence, I think we're speaking of it in like a very one-dimensional manner. Because
I've got a comment, and this is something I've been thinking about, even not being a philosopher. So we underestimate the level that we exist in the physical world, because the part that lives in the physical world of our beings lack language. Like pain, for example. You can't express pain, you can only experience pain. Pain also lacks the sense of time, for example. So if you're in pain, you think it will last forever. But what we have, and same for our smell, the smell organ, the nerves from the smell organ don't pass us through the language center of the brain. So therefore, we don't have, like for visuals, colors. We've got names for colors, but for smells, we only got like smells like an apple or smells like a rose. But there is no, there are no like intrinsic smell language. But when we live in the physical world, a lot of, or a majority of our experiences are lived in the physical world, but we can't really express them because they can only be lived. So same goes for the love that a father feels or a mother feels for their child. Well, try to explain that to ChatGPT. Does it really experience it somewhere? What Sapolsky also says is, okay, so we got this notion that animals, their perception of reality comes, the zebra, as he takes it, sees a lion, not a tiger, because they live in India, not zebras, and gets an amygdala response that makes the zebra run away, and then it wears off. But we've got the opposite direction possible, so we can think about a bank crisis or financial crisis that then that image of a bank crisis goes down into our amygdala and gives us a physical response. And that's part of it being human. And I don't really understand what you mean by not ever being humans, because I think that is being human, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, I probably can clarify that here. What I'm trying to say here is that, as in, it seems to me, I'm trying to bring probably like some like Lacanian concepts here. Like as in we humans, we always have like an access to our existence. So I think the best way to think of this is in terms of like to use like something like the unconscious and like the death drive where they as in okay, to get really speculative philosophy here, we when we think of like this object subject conversation in philosophy, right? I mean, uh, one thing I really like with kind of the work that Philosophy Portal that they do is that it's a very much like a it speaks of subjectivity not as like another thing in the universe, but as rather almost like a split in this universe. As in, the human being is something radically new in reality, almost like a trauma to reality. I mean, Cadell probably could speak to better than to speak better to this than I could. And so, what I mean by that, have we ever been human, is that like I don't even know. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that we're kind of like a process. We're kind of like, there's no, like, I can't point at anything and be like, this is a human being. It's as if in some sense being human is always reaching towards something, and you might call this like an objet or something. And that's kind of what I mean by have you ever been human in that regard. I completely butchered getting across that point, so I think I owe both you, the listener, and Jon a clearer articulation. In that little soliloquy, what I was trying to get across was really 2 points. The first being that this dichotomy between reason and passion is a false one. It could be that this dichotomy has been a part of the Western psyche ever since the Enlightenment, with the triumph of reason, and then in opposition to that, the Romantic movement with those like William Blake and Lord Byron. So in retrospect, one certainly could see how this became a part of our Western ideology. However, the reason I say it's a false dichotomy is because if you look at how reason really works, it's always dialectically linked to passion. In my view, it's a mistake to view the reasoning mind as this cold, calculating machine, but rather we deploy our reasoning faculties through passion. We reason because we have this motivation, desire, whatever you may call it, to reason and use our reasoning faculties. It's not something we do independent to our passions. Now, I don't want to get carried away here, but even the sort of System 1 and System 2 thinking theories from Daniel Kahneman that people like Francois Chollet uses for their own research, I still think those theories, those psychological theories, are still lacking because they still don't account for how much of a role the passions play when one is using their reason. Along those lines, the second point is that I don't believe at all that human beings are utilitarian creatures. It is once again a part of kind of Western individualistic ideology that human beings are these creatures that pursue pleasure, that pursue self-serving ends and that which solely benefits us. On the contrary, I believe human beings are in fact deeply self-destructive. I mean, in colloquial speech, you hear this term self-sabotage, where we do clearly self-destructive acts and partake in clearly self-destructive behavior. And yes, we do see this being intimated at in philosophy and literature and art and cinema, all the way from Schopenhauer and Nietzsche to Kafka and Dostoevsky. However, at least for myself, the most clear explication of this has been in Freudian psychoanalysis, in the concepts of desire and the drive. As Thomas did sort of touch on, desire is where we desire something that we can't have, and Lacan would call this the objet out. It could be we desire a commodity, or we desire a beautiful woman, or we desire some kind of idyllic holiday. We're constantly desiring something to fill the lack in our being or to cover up the split subjectivity, the fundamental contradiction at the core of all of our existence. And this indeed is the objet in the Lacanian jargon, because the objet is a purely virtual object that none of us can have. It's not a physical, real thing in the universe like a mug or a tree. That being said though, while we are desiring beings, one could still argue that this is still a utilitarian act. We are still desiring something consciously that we think will benefit us. And here I think is where the unconscious comes in, because while desire to a certain extent seems utilitarian, at least ostensibly, and we are pursuing something that we think will be good for us, the other side of desire would be what you'd call the drive, or the Freudian death drive. Broadly speaking, as I understand it, the death drive is something that is unconscious. it is not something that even accounts or cares about what you consciously desire, but rather it kind of exists, even you could say ontologically, for its own sake. And in the death drive, what we unconsciously enjoy is not having the object. If you consciously desire a certain commodity or a beautiful woman, let's say, sorry for the chauvinistic example, you think that rationally, consciously, when you do get this thing, you'll be fulfilled, you'll be happy. But unconsciously, your death drive doesn't want you to have this thing. It wants you to fail, and that's where the enjoyment lies. So this fundamentally goes against the logic of utilitarianism, which says that we want to consciously pursue things that make us happy or that benefits us or is good for us. The death drive, on the other hand, completely subverts that logic and says that no, you're not going to have this thing. As a matter of fact, by not having this thing, you will enjoy. You will gain some kind of jouissance, let's say. Put succinctly, the death drive is unconscious and seeks the repetition of failure. Those were the 2 points I was trying to get across.
Yeah, from a Girardian perspective, so that actually, in Girard has a concept called conversion, and it doesn't come from. So he developed this concept not by looking at religious experience and so on. So that he did consider that as well, but it comes from reading Proust. And Proust basically, so did this book À la recherche du temps perdu. So in Search for Lost Time. So he basically investigates his life, or the life of the protagonist of his novel, and this person basically analyzes the driving force of desire, and then discovers that a lot of the things that are so important, that they are basically based on nothing, on illusions. They are based on prestige. They are based on idolizing other human beings. And you basically get caught up in this network of desire that leads you to pursue goals that are they're actually non-existent. The moment that you reach them, you realize that you never wanted them, and you immediately attach yourself to something else. So that's, of course, what Lacan calls this objet petit so there's an object that you want, but it's not even an object, because it's something that doesn't exist. The moment that you get it, the perfect job, the perfect wife, the perfect this, the perfect that, you immediately realize, I'm not happy, and you go to something else. And at some point, there are people who kind of have experiences where they see through those mechanisms, and I think most of us kind of see through it partly. You become wiser with the years, right? You don't realize that stuff that was so important years ago is not important now. And it's not just about becoming wiser in a simple practical sense, but you understand more about the fundamental way in which desire functions. And maybe that is something that could be formulated as we have to become human, in the sense that we have to kind of come to terms with this monster that we have, that this desire, and also the scapegoating mechanism. So the fact that we can form mobs, which is now, of course, also facilitated via the digital network. So we can fall prey to these networks of desire. We can form mobs and then scapegoat people, and becoming aware of these mechanisms and avoiding them. That's part of becoming truly human.
Yes. Thank you, Thomas. That's the word monster. That's what I was looking for here. As in, what I meant by we haven't all fully become human is, I think until we confront, as you point out, Thomas, this kind of monster all within us, I don't think we come to this realization as to how desire functions and how we humans, we do what we do. And that's kind of what I was touching on there, which again, I don't know how you could even, to put it crudely, program that into a machine. I mean, unless I don't know, some kind of biological computing or something. So this is probably, I'm completely out of my domain here, but and that's kind of, for me, fundamentally, almost that monstrous nature of human beings is essentially what makes us human. However, for me, that's not a bad thing. I think that's the most fun part of being human, is that, like, this thing that's this deadlock, this short circuit, you may call it, that's like something's like wrong with human beings, but that's what truly brings something new to reality, to existence. And reducing a human being to like this kind of like, yeah, abstract computational machine, it misses this crucial aspect of what the human is.
You probably don't want a artificial general intelligence that is like humans. I mean, imagine like a human with the power of machine learning, with the speed of machine learning, and that also means that you have the delusions of humanity. So it's not even clear what people mean with AGI. I would say, like, define or look at well-defined problems, like for example the protein folding problem, and then develop an intelligence that can solve that specific problem. It's not entirely clear it's not clear at all what people mean with an artificial general intelligence.
Yeah, fair. I mean, look, one thing I really like is, for example, Francois Chalet, the ARC AGI challenge. It's a very practical tool, and he says this not to see if we've built AGI, but it can be used as a research tool to see where our models are at. And I agree. And I actually, to be fair, I don't really think. Well, in fact, the only person I've heard mention this is is Geoffrey Hinton, who said that like our current models can eventually become an AGI. And then there are a few others, but most people that I find have thought deeply about this. They don't even speak of AGI. They speak of like practical problems that AI agents could solve. And people like name here, people like yeah, Chalet or even Jan LeCun. Um, Excellent. Yeah, I would like to move on to, just in the interest of time, move on to the whole notion of democratization. However, before that, is there anything we want to touch on here, gentlemen?
I mean, I'll just quickly say something like in regards to the monstrousness, and I think that what is perhaps to me the missing link in this conversation is the way in which, on the one hand, the disembodied machine uploading ideology, which Thomas is critiquing within computer science, is fundamentally linked, I think, to the reproduction of the capitalist economy in a certain way. Like, because, in many ways, what this is about is, I think John's also pointed towards this, is like, it's about attracting investment, and what do capitalists find attractive, and how can we keep that going? And I think one of the things within neoliberal society that I think the principle for me of increasingly what neoliberal society is it's trying to achieve immortality without impossibility. And I think promising people who have a lot of money immortality is driving a lot of this. And it's childish and it's ridiculous, but I think it's at the core of this. It's about attracting what people with money think is shiny, which is at a certain point is the idea that your ego could achieve immortality through some sort of disembodied uploading procedure. And I know it's ridiculous, but like there are a lot of people within these transhumanist circles that quite literally believe this is possible. And still, this is the unconscious presupposition that you and ultimately what's said about it is about escaping the body, and it is about escaping precisely the pain body, and it's about escaping the limitations that come with having a body, and not seeing those limitations as positive, not seeing the limitations of the body as a positive thing, and not being able to move beyond and contradict your own pleasure principle, that you're gonna have to suck it up and work with pain, and you're gonna have to work with these weird inversions that are there. And so, again, back to, are we human yet? Have we ever been human? Thomas pointing towards mimetic desire and the scapegoat mechanism. We are going to have to become more embodied, and part of that, I would say, bringing out the human general intelligence is going to have to come from a more expansive development of the humanities. And that's precisely what we've lost. All of the universities have been turned to STEM fields. There is no place for the humanities anymore. We need to construct a new ground for the humanities, and the various philosophers that we're referring to, or thinkers we're referring to, could be the seed ground of what that future humanities look like. But it's going to involve thinking about desire. It's going to involve thinking about scapegoating. It's going to involve thinking about embodiment. It's going to involve thinking about a more expansive notion of intelligence. It's going to involve all of these things, right? And at the end of the day, to me, it is also going to have to confront a critique of the type of mind that has created these fantasies of a post-human world, which is related to neoliberal capitalism. They're fundamentally entangled. And I'll just say, I think this is why Mikey Downs is working with Nick Land's work, is because one of the ideas in Nick Land is that we've already got a disembodied artificial general intelligence. It's capitalism. Capitalism is the artificial general intelligence, right? It's already here in a certain way. So I don't know if that's relevant, but I just throw that into the mix.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, on one other, I know, Karel, you know of this. Adrian Johnston wrote this book, Infinite Greed. And you had an excellent conversation with him, Karel.
Yeah.
It's this notion of the capital. It's wrong to think of capitalists as being these like self-serving utilitarians. On the contrary,
Yeah, exactly.
on the contrary, it's like this drive that goes, it's using Freudian death drive. It's like this drive that has no account for anything really. It has no account for serving even itself. It's like this constant self-destructive process that keeps on going.
We don't know how to go beyond ourselves. That like the human has to be able to be something that's going beyond itself. And the problem with neoliberal ideology is that it gets caught up into this capitalist mechanism where the only way you can go beyond yourself is through basically profit maximization, accumulation of surplus value, or it's through sacrificing yourself to the commodity form, right? But we don't know how to go beyond that paradigm.
Yeah. I mean, also,
Okay,
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Thomas.
yeah, but there is no such thing as pure capitalism. I mean, we are in a system where you have political institutions, you have all kinds of other forces than capitalism. So what you are talking about here is some kind of neoliberal dystopia, but in practice, capitalism is something that takes mimetic desire and tries to do something useful with it, which is the same. Science is the same thing. Scientists are driven by prestige, right? They're driven by mimetic desire, but institutions channel this potentially destructive behavior, this potentially destructive mechanism into something that produces results. And capitalism has produced enormous results by channeling mimetic desire. It's far from perfect, but then again, like the perfection, the desire to perfection is actually the most pernicious desire ever. That always leads to complete destruction. It always ends up in the fascist camps, in the communist gulags. I was just learning about Oliver Cromwell and the English Civil Wars. It's this desire for absolute purity that is really, really super destructive. I'm actually much more afraid of that than I'm afraid of some abstract capitalism. Now, the deeper question is, like we have, for example, the university world, the world of science, the world of capitalism. Basically, these are systems that say, like, okay, there is mimetic desire, how we can actually kind of tweak this mechanism that is just there, that people are prone to, how can we do something constructive with that. And then another thing that I would kind of be very careful with is that, so there is this referring to some kind of time where it was better. We lost this, we lost that. I mean, then I would like to ask, like, what time are you referring to? Maybe you're referring to some kind of tribal situation where you had a very well functioning system of the profane and the sacred. And I think that was probably like a very easy way of living. But then again, if you were sick, then you died, right? I mean, you break your leg, and that was the end game, right? So if you're talking about it was better previously until capitalism came along or until something else come along.
No, we're saying we're talking about something that's never existed.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think we should be totally on the defense of the retroactive fantasy of the utopian past. This has to be
le nom du
right?
Yeah.
Yes,
No,
yes.
It's about something that hasn't existed yet.
Yeah. I mean, it's a critique of the current ideology, but I agree with you, Thomas. Like, I'm the thing is, like, I don't even think capitalism, as to how people think of it in like an ideal sense, ever existed. You're right. It exists. It's more like we currently, as Yanis Varoufakis point out, we probably now live in a techno-feudal model, as opposed to a neoliberal capitalistic model. However, I would just add this here too, if it's okay, Cadell. I don't know what your thoughts on this are, and I think we still have time to discuss this. I also wouldn't say I have a nostalgia for the future. Now I'm gonna say a very male chauvinistic thing here. I forgot her name, but Zizek's wife, she wrote. I forgot her name, but I know her as Zizek's wife, Star Wars Zizek's wife. Anyway, I'll put up the name on the screen when I'm editing this. She wrote this paper about having a nostalgia for the future. This idea, almost like, yeah, look, now things are now terrible. Things now are just like it's completely bad. However, in some sense, we have like it's almost like a utopian kind of thinking, but with the same nostalgia we had for the past, we project it to the future. It's highly unlikely, but through some random chance, if Jella Krejcik ever listens to this podcast, I do want to apologize for completely misrepresenting her point, because in nowhere in this piece does she even talk about anything close to what I was trying to articulate. As Carl mentioned, I was merely talking about escapism, but it had nothing to do with anything Jella Krejcik has said or wrote. That being said, though, if you are interested in reading about nostalgia, I highly recommend this piece by Jella Krejcik. In the sense that we can, so the idea is we can still escape.
Both are problematic.
Yeah, both are problematic. Yeah,
correct. Both are problematic. I think to me, the most realistic stance for what we are and our life is a process of potentially deepening contradiction.
What do you mean by that? Probably just to outline.
Let me just give the example of global politics or global warming. Any of these global issues, these are contradictions that didn't exist 200 years ago, right? They're contradictions we're faced with now. In a certain way, what we mean by progress is sort of progressing into deeper contradictions that didn't exist before. And I think perhaps the abstraction explosion is a part of that. It's bringing us to face newer, richer forms of contradiction, but it's not bringing us towards. In some sense, it's better. I think that the idea of ephemeralization and stigmergy that's already been mentioned. I mean, both these processes are enabling greater capacities. They're enabling greater powers. But they come with new contradictions. They come with new problems as well.
Yeah, isn't it a Zizek quote? Don't worry, there will be new problems.
Yes,
exactly. Don't worry, there'll be new problems. Yeah, exactly.
I think that's kind of how I. That's how I think about humanity, right?
But I think that's what
we're always on the brink of extinction. We're always on the brink of extinction, right? It's always like that.
Yeah.
I think like the contradiction that Thomas, you always bring up that I like is where I think our work meets is, the archaic human meets the global digital network. Like that.
Right.
That is a situation that simply didn't exist in the past. It exists now, and it's actually the source of challenges and contradictions that force us to think, and these are what we have to work through.
Yes. As Zizek says, the light at the end of the tunnel is an oncoming train. So Also, it's Jela Krejcik. That's her name for the listener. Jurik's wife. So anyway, excellent conversation. Okay, great segue. I did want to discuss 5.4 just to bring it a bit more to the political grounded level, democratization of deep learning. Yeah, so I mean, you don't in the paper you don't claim that deep learning because of this abstraction explosion that it's been fully democratized. However, you even mentioned here. So I'll just read this excerpt out. I think it's useful for the listener. This you say in addition, DLSF, which is deep learning software frameworks, provide access to technologies that previously required in-depth knowledge of mathematics, statistics, and programming, which lowers the demands with respect to required education, as we discussed on this. And then this in turn facilitates faster adoption of technology by a wider range of users of DLSFs as specialized or in-depth knowledge is not required. Which is great. You see that in industry. And then you claim here, we note that although the DLSFs have democratized deep learning, access to the most advanced deep learning models are moving in the opposite direction. Models such as GPT-3 are only accessible through an API, which is shared with a limited pool of people. Exactly. So I was quite surprised because, in my view, I feel like, yes, for sure, we have like the open source world. One of my programming heroes, Linus Torvald, he's a huge advocate of the open source movement. But I mean, he would probably argue that, in fact, it seems that technology is going to the opposite of being decentralized. It's becoming more centralized. I mean, case in point here would be things like cloud computing, where most of ML models they run on servers owned by either Microsoft for OpenAI or for AWS. And I'm curious as to like I mean this perfectly connects to our conversation around capitalism, neoliberalism, all of this. But yeah, I mean, to put it in simple terms, do you think deep learning is actually becoming democratized, or does it seem more that we're moving towards a techno-feudal model? Maybe we could go with you, Jon.
If you talk about deep learning as one entity, I think we're making a mistake, because with these programming frameworks, people who did not know how to program before, or who knows very little programming, like myself, can build models that 10 years ago required someone like Thomas, who knows both the mathematics behind it, but also how to build it with many, many, many lines of code. So has it made me, as a novice programmer, more powerful? Yes. Does it mean that I have access to all deep learning tools and technologies available in the world? No, because at the same time, we've seen another transition where we've got huge models who run on large servers, and the access to those is what you call the techno-feudal model. More so, we see a concentration of power. Microsoft, OpenAI, Google. So we don't have access to those, but we do have access to other tools that makes us super powerful. So just that, well, we've got probably other technologies in our, like the cell phone. Does that mean that you control the whole infrastructure? No, it doesn't. But it means that you can make your life easier.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah, I think that was basically what we were talking about in that section that you read. I grew up, I installed Linux on my computer at home with like 40 floppy disks, downloading it and then just having access to a Unix machine, and then realizing that you have access to all these languages, C++ and so on and so on. And I mean, for me, that was that was wonderful to have that experience, because I remember when you read about, oh, there's something called C++ or there's something like that, but you wouldn't be able to get to it. I mean, yeah, you could buy it or something like that, but even that was not you didn't have the know-how. It was difficult to find out things. And then suddenly everything was just was just available. So now you just, if you want to develop a deep learning algorithm, you just install PyTorch, right, and on your laptop, and you're up and running. And you can buy an external GPU, or you can do some cloud computing. I mean, if you are young and talented and you want to invest some time, and you can do so much. So there's definitely a democratization there. And that doesn't mean, of course, that you do not have access to 1 million TPUs like Google. Of course not. But yeah, that's another aspect, of course. Yeah, and that there's a limitation there. You don't have access to all the compute. But there's an enormous democratization aspect as well, I think.
Yep, Karel, do you want to comment on that?
I mean, the only thing I really want to say here is that, like, what I've seen when I started at the Global Brain Institute for my doctoral thesis, there was kind of this encounter confrontation with this idea that the future is going to be completely distributed. And there's a lot of people in the AGI space that think, the future is going to be completely decentralized. And that centralization is the enemy. I think where I come to on these things is that I think that we need to think in terms of almost an endless dialectics of centralization and decentralization, or centralization and distribution. That these processes are always going to be in some sort of dialectic with each other. And I think in regards to some of maybe the philosophical language that Thomas and I have worked with at Philosophy Portal, I'm thinking here that when I encounter people who embody the ideology of some sort of decentralization as a path to utopia, it's kind of what's organizing that is kind of, I think, a Dionysian energy. And then when I see people who think centralization needs to be used to combat decentralization, there's perhaps kind of an Apollonian energy there that's at work in that direction. So I think there's kind of a dialectics of this that's at work, and probably there are forces that are counterbalancing each other. But I do think that when I see people on the decentralized end of like Web3 technology, they're probably underestimating the capacity of the modern state to use this technology, right? And develop this technology. Like, I don't know, like, what's the future of blockchain and Bitcoin and Web3 technologies? How does the European Union, or how does the American government use these technologies? Right? I mean, I think the power of these entities to take up these technologies and use them to their benefit is probably high.
There's one more thing that I would like to add, and when we talk about democratization, so ChatGPT, for example, has given us access to very, very powerful models, and there is even a free version, but you only get access to the more powerful, like 401, that is most powerful that exists now, if you pay $20. And from a Western point of view, or at least rich world point of view, that's not an issue. But if you live in Gambia or Congo, $20 is enough to feed your family for 3 months. So we can also see a separation. So to those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. So you see this discrepancy. And also we talk about the techno-feudal society, but if we look at China, for example, at least we got a couple of big players that are competing in healthy competition, trying to outcompete each other. In China, you only see one concentration of power, which makes the lives of the Chinese, it's more difficult to talk about democratization there, I'd say. So we have to bear in mind that we in this podcast now are very Western centric, we could say.
Yeah. I mean, I see where you all are coming from. I guess I'm always wary of giving control of these technologies to the whims of capital. That's my only concern. I mean, also maybe I'm just too much of a Marxist here, and then also to like.
But what's the alternative?
Well,
So,
I mean,
again,
I think
there's never only capitalism, right? It's not under the control of capitalism. That doesn't exist. It's under the control of a free market. that is controlled by institutions, by politics. It's not completely controlled, but there is no free market capitalism. It's kind of like a master signifier that people throw around. It simply doesn't exist. There is no wild capitalism that is completely unconstrained. That is a neoliberal fantasy. Yes, and people often talk about it, but at the end of the day, everything is heavily regulated. And when people talk about these things, it's often like there's some kind of mythical better way, but it's not clear at all what it would be. I would say, like, you cannot get around of a certain amount of free competition, of a certain amount of capitalism, of people taking free initiatives and going into competition, because that's what capitalism is. I mean, capitalism in that sense, science is also like, we try different things and then the best stuff wins. And of course, you're not allowed to do everything. We can't just do any test we want on humans or even on animals, and rightfully so. There are rules and regulations, and so. But what's the alternative? I'm kind of like, in what direction are we thinking here? Is it a completely abstract space that we're talking about?
One tying back to what Thomas said earlier. So we now talk about, so we have a techno-feudal society where Microsoft, Google, and OpenAI controls these models, but that's assuming that these models are the best models or the best technology tomorrow.
Exactly.
But we don't know that. So
fragile.
So if we see that we're coming to an end of the benefits that we can get from large language models, then something else is developing that we're not aware of, and it's developing because of, or thanks to, the capitalistic society that gives it an arena to develop, because there's actually someone who's willing to fund it.
I mean, if you look at the space of these huge companies, huge companies that look extremely powerful now. I mean, let's take a look in 10 years. Many of these companies will be simply gone, and there are many companies that look completely, unassailable. These are going to be around forever, and they just crashed and burned like enormously. I mean, look at Intel, for example, which was huge a couple of years ago. Now it's in trouble. So yeah, I mean, that feudalism also, well, what does it actually mean? It's like that powerful, that there are companies around that have a lot of money and that have a lot of power. Yes, but I mean, these things are also constantly under criticism and attacked by other entities, by politicians that are trying to regulate them, by competitors. It's hardly like we are slaves to specific companies. I think that would be like an enormous overstatement and like almost like a self-victimization position. I would say.
We can see. So if I don't remember which year this was, but Economist wrote an article a couple of years back. Data is the new oil.
Yeah.
And they criticized Google because Google then had access to all the world's data, because we were using Google to look things up, and they could control our behaviors on the internet. All of a sudden, OpenAI comes in from the left, and we start inputting even more self-exposing questions into ChatGPT that they get access to. So all of a sudden, we've got a competitor to Google. That was unheard of and unimaginable because the technology didn't exist. And that is sort of the essence of the article, that what you think is state of the art today and what you view your whole reality as the truth is just completely obsolete. 2 years from now could be like totally overthrown.
Yeah, people are, for example, also, people don't throw stuff on Facebook anymore. Everything is getting much more private. Everything is moving into private WhatsApp groups. So the landscape is constantly shifting. Like OpenAI is a good example. So they made their big breakthrough, ChatGPT, using a technology that was developed by Google. But Google didn't use it because they were afraid of the implications. and rightfully so.
Oh yeah,
I mean, understandably so. Excuse me?
The paper attention is all you need, which the transfer.
Attention is all you need. That was Google. That was DeepMind. So they had the technology, but they didn't use it.
Yeah. I mean, Karel, I'm sure you've got stuff to add here, but I just want to mention one thing here, just to clarify. When I mean capital, I'm in fact not talking about markets, because in fact, Jon, what you use the perfect example, China. I think I'm becoming, leaving aside the civil rights, which is bad, I know. But in terms of their economy, I think I'm becoming a bit of a fan there. In fact, last year, now Australians, we can go to China without a visa. So I'll be going this year. I'm very excited for that. And the reason being, I'll put it this way, right? I think that the good thing about it being centralized and having a state is it allows us to have a certain amount of alienation and kind of like go on with our day. So I'll use this example. What I would ideally like as a code monkey, as a software guy, is I would not want to worry at all about AWS overbilling me or having to suddenly pay $500 because I left a S3 bucket open or something, and just wake up in the morning, spin up an EC2 instance or whatever, and just do my programming in my alienated life, and let the state take care of all of that work where all the stuff that we leave the market. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not saying we should get rid of markets. In fact, quite the opposite. As Varoufakis points out, we can't have markets without capitalism. The only thing I'm bringing up here is like the precarity that capitalism introduces to our lives, where I mean, the truth is, why, in my view, why is there this rise in fascism and kind of, Trumpism and all these populist movements? I think a part of that is because of how volatile society has become, mostly due to our current ideology, which is neoliberal capitalism. But that being said, I'm not saying we should move to kind of like a monarchy or this model without any markets. All I'm saying is, with especially technologies like what we have in deep learning or AI, perhaps it could be left more to a system that serves. So like ideally in like a Hegelian sense, the state serves the people. Perhaps if these tools are, I don't know if the term really is regulated here, because as you rightly point out, Thomas, they already are quite regulated. But if it could be moved away from the volatility of what capitalism introduces to our lives and into our individual subjective experiences, I think it could serve humanity better. And that's why maybe I'm overly romanticizing China here, but I do like the Chinese model because, they kind of do run like a fascist state, but at least economically, they do have some things that I think are better than what we have here in the West. So again, I'm just being speculative here, but just a few thoughts there.
I don't understand what it is you think that is better. So you want to live a life without worry. So essentially, if we go back to the historic utopia, you want to be the hunter out in the forest, but you want to remove all predators so that you can chase down your prey without sort of having to worry about anything.
I wouldn't say a life without growth.
And then also you want something like the state. Who is the state? And who controls the state is also a question. So who is going to make sure that they look after you? It's almost like, I think Karel, I know, has a beautiful word for this, like the big other.
Big other.
Oh. Yeah. So someone that sees you and your needs and make sure, but at the same time, if we look at how China, for example, looks after the Uyghurian people, I'm sure they don't like the China model as much.
Yeah.
So that it becomes, I don't understand why.
Maybe I'm defending China too much here. All I'm trying to say is this: I think we can strive towards an existence that allows people to be alienated together. And what I mean by that is there are certain things like, of course, like we speak on people like Bernie Sanders in the US speak of, things like healthcare, Medicare, all of them taken care by the state, universal healthcare. I support all of that, lovely things. However, I'm wondering if there are things even in the technological domain, if there could be things taken care by the state in terms of, I don't know, maybe maybe nationalizing AWS or like cloud computing or the Azure service, so that essentially, let's call it, people working in these technical disciplines don't have to worry about having to pay to use all of these things, or maybe more free market approach, like what recently NVIDIA, I think they released like a GPU specific to having, like, you can like, buy it and run your ML models on it, and instead of having to pay for that, why not just the government, give it away to people? I mean, I'm just, maybe I'm being too overly idealistic here. All I'm trying to say is, I think we can do better than what we have right now. But better in this sense, better in the sense of not in a utopian sense, rather kind of treating technology also as some kind of human right, the way like a leftist politician would speak of healthcare or education, or something along those lines, if that makes sense, John.
Makes sense, but I don't understand how you aim to get there.
Oh yeah, I mean, nor do I, nor do I. I'm just putting things out here. One thing I like about philosophy is we don't have to ever offer solutions, just you know either problematize things. So I enjoy that. And I should also mention this. I don't know about your company and how it's like in you're from Sweden, right, John? But in Sweden, I know, like in Australia, there's an interesting. I've been talking to a lot of people, like at least in Sydney, in like the tech community here. A lot of people are trying to move away from cloud computing and move to in-house servers, because the reason is they feel too coupled to like AWS or GCP or something, and they're trying to actually move away from this, kind of techno-feudal model, and trying to host their own projects in in-house servers. And again, this is for reasons of just having a bit more autonomy over what we build. So there's
But it's also a matter of cost.
and cost, of course.
So when you do enough computing in the cloud, it's at some point it becomes more cheaper to run it in-house.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
And also, you don't need to work on things that require this enormous amount of computing, right? I mean, there are many things that maybe the next big algorithm will be developed on somebody with a laptop and an eGPU, right? So it's also kind of like, again, this idea that, so there's these mimetic bubbles, right? So now it's all these large language models. You need 1,000 TPUs to train them. I cannot do that. There are so many open problems there. Also with respect to integration of statistics and deep learning with uncertainty and stuff like that. So that you can develop completely novel methods as maybe only as proof of principles on a single laptop. I mean, I'm currently working on something not even using a GPU. It's a deep learning model, and so, but it's so small, and it's like I do a simple point estimation, variational base, and I can run this on a simple laptop, and if it works, then I know I can scale it up to something that is much bigger. So it's also a bit like, think out of the box. The fact that you have all this information available, you have the software available. It's freely, PyTorch comes from Facebook, TensorFlow from Google, JAX from Google. These companies are doing incredible things, that they make all this software available to all these thousands and thousands of people that are just doing tremendous things with it. I think it's tremendous. So it's not all doom and gloom, I would say. Yes, okay, there are issues with computations and things like that, and accessibility in poor countries. But maybe they also have, these countries have other problems than access to large language models, right? They need institutions, they need infrastructure. You know, like we also tend to live in this world of bits. And what I think is that we're going to see a lot more stuff happening in the world in the real world. Like I was recently at a conference about protein structure prediction. I actually hadn't been to a conference like that because most of the stuff that I'm doing is more theoretical, more method development. But I was baffled by the fact that there was almost nobody who talked about methods. This is now a solved problem. So everybody was designing enzymes, was designing vaccines. You know, there were people talking about vaccines against snake venoms and peptides against snake venoms. There were people making enzymes that break down plastics. This was all like, you know, this is a solved problem, or we take it as a solved problem, and now we want to do stuff in the world. So, and I think that's gonna become much more important in the coming years. People who do stuff in the real world and using machine learning methods. It's a bit like, you know, everybody was probably very enthusiastic about the calculator when it came out, the pocket calculator, but after some time, you know, the novelty wore off, right? And then people just started using it and did some interesting stuff with it.
Yeah, excellent. Karel, anything? I wonder if you've got anything to add here.
Not really. Just maybe that we sort of point towards closing with a highlighting of the paper and the idea of the abstraction explosion, so that people sort of get a sense of what they're heading into if they want to read the paper itself.
Absolutely, yeah. That was kind of how I wanted to conclude too. And also one other thing, I had two last question. In fact, was kind of where you see the kind of more practical question. However, yes, please, if you could maybe comment on that, Jon or Thomas, just what to expect if people do get into this paper, and then I'll ask my final question, and I believe we can conclude there because you've touched on a lot of things here.
Well, Jon, it's your PhD work. I'll give you the honor.
So if they read this paper, they will get a quantification of the abstraction within deep learning, but then trying to sort of shed light on, okay, so what are the benefits of this abstraction explosion that we see? And what could be the potential drawbacks as well that sort of can make you comprehend society and perhaps your own perception of society in a different way. What would you like to add, Thomas?
Yeah, well, I think that, well, it was actually also written from a company point of view, right? Because you basically were faced with the problem, okay, we have this revolution, deep learning, machine learning, how can we integrate this in a company? It's also a company that has safety regulations. It's not trivial. And then and I think that this paper actually kind of points out some things that would be interesting for managers who not necessarily, or leaders who not necessarily know too much about deep learning, and then kind of, because it has quite a few concepts that are kind of interesting to just see written down very concretely, right? So you can hire people who are very good at working with these high levels of abstractions, but then when things go wrong, you suddenly have something that doesn't work and you have no way to solve it. You might have to hire people who are very, very hard to find, very expensive, because there are few people who actually have the expertise to go beyond these abstractions that everybody's using. So these kinds of ideas are in that paper. And there are other ideas, and I think it's kind of worth reading it if you're faced with this. How do I implement deep learning methods, machine learning methods in practical circumstances? Like in a company, I'm a leader, I have to implement that. What are some of the things that I need to be aware of? I found that very interesting, actually, to just learn. As an academic, you don't really know how things are going in a company, right? And I learned a lot from working with you and understanding that things that I think are trivial, why don't you just install this software and then try it out? And it turned out like, well, Thomas, you know, it doesn't really work like that. And I think some of these things ended up in the paper, and I found that very interesting.
Beautiful. Thank you, Thomas. All right, this is the last question, and this is a purely self-serving question for me here. I want to ask from really yourself, Thomas and Jon, you both really. So my plan after I do my master's is to, of course, move on to doing a PhD. And then I'm wondering, okay, I really do want to do the PhD in computer science and AI. Um, but then I'm wondering if I should go into industry, uh, or stick to, or try and find something within academia, or perhaps this is a false dualism. Like maybe I could, in some sense, do both. I've met academics who kind of work both in industry and while working in academia. But yeah, so just what advice would you have for people that are interested in, AI, deep learning, all of this research, probably partially due to Mimesis, because that's where kind of the zeitgeist is going. Whether, I'd be curious to hear what areas of research do you think people should look into? I think a lot of us agreed here, maybe LLMs aren't the thing to research. There are other things to research in AI. But yeah, if that I think that'd be really useful for any listener of the podcast. Maybe we'll go with you, Jon, and then Thomas and Cadell.
So what is very difficult for me in my role to find are people willing to do the preparation of the data.
On the topics that Jon was talking about pertaining to feature engineering, pre-processing, and overall data engineering, I highly recommend these 3 books. I've read 2 of them, Designing Machine Learning Systems by Chip Huon and Fundamentals of Data Engineering by Joe Rees and Matt Housley. Now, the other one, AI Engineering, is the latest one by Chip Huon, which I haven't read yet. I think it came out 2 or 3 months ago, but I did hear from my colleagues that it's a really good book, and in fact is a lot better than even her previous one, Designing Machine Learning Systems. So I would recommend these 3 books for sure, and just in general, O'Reilly does really good books on software engineering and machine learning engineering.
And the sort of boring stuff. So we talk a lot about AI models that can analyze data, but then when we talk about it from an academic point of view, we often talk about fixed data sets, pre-prepared data sets. The data is all structured and beautiful and everything works. In the industry, it's the opposite. You've got data of poor quality. You don't know where the hell it comes from. You don't know what's intended for. You don't know really how to get access to it. And once you get it, you get a dump of some sort, depending on which industry you're in. And then you have to try to start to make sense of the data first with human intelligence, because only then, when you know the data, can you upload it into a model. It's easier for me to find AI computer engineers than it is to find data engineers. People who are willing to do, like librarians, who categorize things and clean things up and make them nice and orderly and pipeline and those. So if you want to work with data, work with the raw material. And that's also what I see in the industry. There is a shift in focus from this AI obsession to, okay, so maybe we need to focus on data as well.
Just to clarify, do you mean this is like feature engineering or working on like pre-processing and
Pre-processing and data governance and how do we build efficient data governance systems and quality controls? Because if you start processing large amounts of data, you want to maintain high levels of quality. So how do you encode automatic quality monitoring, for example?
Yeah, yep, I see. Yeah, in my previous company, I did a bit of work on that, and I feel like it's a whole other world outside of kind of the more the sexy ML and AI stuff. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to mention deep probabilistic programming.
This really is Thomas's area of expertise, and he's done a lot of research on deep probabilistic programming and computational biology. I'll leave a link to Thomas's Google Scholar in the show notes. He's got a lot of papers on the topic, and I certainly am keen to sink my teeth into them. But broadly speaking, at a very high level, deep probabilistic programming is combining deep learning, which of course we know is neural network based, with probabilistic programming, which again at a very high level allows you to write code that explicitly represents, let's say, uncertainty in our data and our parameters or hyperparameters.
I think that is very cool. This is, of course, something that I do research in. So that's basically probabilistic models and deep learning. So you combine neural networks with probabilistic models. I think that is an incredibly exciting field. That also means you interact with statisticians. They have so much know-how. Often statistics is kind of reinvented in the role of computer science. So work with statisticians. I've enjoyed that for many years. And also work with PL people, experts in programming languages, the science of programming languages. There is so much you can do if you are in contact with people who really have deep knowledge in statistics and in programming languages. And then, causal modeling. Also super interesting. I think world building, so models that actually are not just generating language, but actually have an internal representation of the world. So these are some of the things that come to mind. And then with respect to industry versus university, right? Stay in both. If you work in industry, keep contact with academics. I mean, they often have all kinds of crazy ideas, specialized knowledge that you can use, and there's so many companies that I walk into a company and it's all we're an AI company, and then I look under the hood and it's a linear model. Okay, it's not even a Bayesian linear model. I mean, if you're lucky, they do a bit of regularization. So companies really need to get specialized knowledge from academics. I think they're underused, at least in Europe, and also again for the academics. If you stay in academia, keep track of some exciting companies that are doing fun stuff. So apply your stuff, see it work in the world. Develop some vaccines or help a company produce stuff. It's incredibly satisfying, and it kind of keeps your mind open, right? So collaborate across the divide, university and company, and maybe even include a philosopher. Shout out to Cadell. They can be very interesting as well. And I think that this in the future, I think that one of the really big problems in Europe that we don't have enough crosstalk between industry and academia. Academia often is not aware of protecting IP, of making portfolios of patents and stuff like that. And I think that a closer integration of industry and academia will be incredibly beneficial.
There is one other job that is really fascinating, and that's being able to translate between the two domains. So talking about business and computer science. Because business people don't understand computer science, and computer science don't understand business. So it's a matter of identifying this is a business problem that we have, and it translates into this computer science problem. Yeah. And it's very few people who can do that efficiently. They either become too technical or too business oriented.
Yeah, that's a whole other. As you saw, Jon, even myself, I couldn't properly articulate some of the ideas I had in my head. It's just sometimes bridging them together. It's indeed quite a challenge. Something I'm working on, honestly. And I should say here, Thomas, just to add to your point, as a good patriot, I should defend Australia here, because I do really feel that there is a lot of cross collaboration between industry and academia. Like when I was doing my computer science degree, we were exposed quite a lot to industry, and that's one thing at least I could say for CS based fields. I see quite that Australia gets they do it quite well. I don't know about the US, probably not at that level, but at least over here. But no, I'm glad you mentioned that. But yes, Cadell, as the in-house philosopher, how do you think we should approach, like if someone wants to go into this sort of research, what advice would you have?
I mean, I just want to reemphasize the human general intelligence idea, that like just in regards to the human specialization dimension, that you already are in many ways a human general intelligence, and to stay true to that, and just to I think there are a lot of great benefits to the specialization. But just to keep that in a feedback with the whole of what you are, philosophy can be one way to help with that, but many other things as well. I think that what we've lost in our generation, and I think probably I'm like a canary in the coal mine for this, but certainly your generation is confronting this more directly, is that we've lost a single track or a single career path towards retirement. Like in the 20th century, there was more of a single, career path that you could plan out. And I think that today we've simply lost that. And so what we need is the capacity to keep thinking with the contradictions of the present moment in a way that's working between different sectors, in a way that's working between different disciplines. So yeah, I mean, I think you're already doing that. I mean, in many ways, you are already that. You're doing the YouTube channel, you're doing masters on the side, you're doing a little bit here, you're doing a little bit there. I think keep experimenting with things that seem unconventional, but that in a way that enhance, the whole of your life, the whole of your thinking process. And if you do that, I think you'll find yourself in a place in 10 or 20 years that none of us would be able to cognize at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm blushing.
And you got access to us, so you can always reach out wherever you're at in your career.
Thank you. I'm deeply grateful. Yeah, yeah. That's yeah, gentlemen, this has been lovely. It was truly was an honor. I hope I did a okay job at moderating this discussion, but yeah, since we've gone way over time, I'll end it here. But again, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.